The August 13th, 2013 meeting of the Santa Barbara City Council Finance Committee will now come to order. Are there any members of the public wishing to speak on topics within the jurisdiction of this committee but not on today's agenda? Seeing none, let us go forward.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Finance Committee Chair Francisco and committee members. Today we will be presenting to you a fourth quarter financial review for the fiscal year 2013. My name is Jeannie Wilson. I'm the Treasury Manager. And myself and along with the Accounting Manager, Julie Nemes, will be presenting to you the report. Okay, the first section I'll be covering are the city's major revenues or general fund revenues. And I will start off with sales tax. And through June 30th of 2013, the city exceeded its budget estimates by over $460,000. This is an indication of the healthy recovery in sales tax and retail sales, actually. The city, although this is a healthy indication of how the city is performing, the city has not yet quite reached its peak sales tax revenue year of 2007. But we do anticipate in 2014 reaching those levels once again. As far as property tax goes, we did exceed our revenue estimates by about $580,000. I think this is due to greater than expected growth estimates. I would like to point out that there was a 16% increase over the prior year, which is fairly significant. It amounts to about $3.8 to $3.9 million. This was as a result of the dissolution of the RDA. $2.3 million of that money was a one-time payment to the city, and about $1.5 of that is going to be ongoing property tax revenue that the general fund will now be eligible for on an ongoing basis. Transient occupancy.
Mr. White has a question.
Sure.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
So, separating that out, how did we do? I mean, the RDA stuff is its own
Right.
critter. So, how did we do?
So
Separating that out,
because we did adjust the budget for those items, we're about 2% higher than what we forecasted or estimated.
Thank you.
Okay. Transient occupancy tax revenues have remained strong, and at year-end, estimates are expected to exceed budget. We're estimating that to be about at year-end when we reach accruals of $186,000. And this over last year is about a 7% increase. There was some rooms that were added with one of the hotels that reopened, and I think that's an indication of some of that increase. Business license revenue exceeded budget estimates by about $294,000. I think this is an indication of strong economic growth and increased business licenses during the past fiscal year. Property tax revenue also had an increase of $280,000 or almost $290,000 as a result, again, of a rebound in the real estate sales market. This property tax transfer tax revenue is based on transfers or sales of property, and basically the equation is an equation of about it's $1.10 per thousand, or that equates to about $1,100 per million of value, property value. So anytime properties sell, the city receives and collects that proportionate share per million. We've seen an increase over the prior year steadily in each month. However, we did see a pretty significant increase in the month of January. There must have been a pretty big sale or multiple sales for some reason in that month.
One question on the business license tax. I know that we did an audit recently on business licenses. Do we know what proportion of that was due to the auditing?
From my calculations, I believe about 2/3 of that increase were a result of additional business licenses complying with the city's ordinance and was a result of those increases.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. The next slide will cover some various revenues such as licenses and permits, fines and forfeitures, franchise fees, use of property, Intergovernmental miscellaneous. I will highlight a few of those. Fines and forfeitures reflect a negative variance of about $121,000. This appears to be a decrease in utility billing late fees of about $30,000, parking violations, a decrease of $37,000, and municipal court fines, a decrease of about $72,000. In the category of intergovernmental revenues, we did exceed the budget by well over $400,000, and this is primarily as a result of some additional reimbursements for fire department mutual aid monies that were received by other agencies. The miscellaneous category, that's a rather large category. Over half of that is really, these are revenues that don't fall into the major categories, but for example, in this category, half of that represents charges for services, for administrative services to other departments. So those charges are reflected in this category and exceed about $5.6 million.
Mr. Chair,
Certainly. Ms. Murillo?
may I ask that you next time give us a breakdown of those? The number
miscellaneous?
is so big,
Okay.
11 million, 12 million. It would be nice to have a separate table.
Okay.
Thank you.
We'll put a different, separate table that'll itemize the major sections of that.
Mr. White also has a question.
Well, thank you. Just, in other words, the intergovernmental services is the area where departments are charging ourselves, and that's what I'm hearing you talk about in the miscellaneous
Right.
category as well. So
Interfund,
that's kind of a-
interfund charges, but you're right. If we outline that, you'll be able to see that a little bit clearer.
yeah, because and I presume that the intergovernmental line
It's for
is a
other
cousin
agencies.
of that
But
as well.
generally, that's other agencies, intergovernmental revenues from other agencies. For example, as I mentioned in the fire department, when they get reimbursed for mutual aid to other agencies, then that's the revenue line item that we'll be posting to.
Okay,
So,
thank you. So the miscellaneous piece is contains all the charges
Internal.
of our internal.
Yes.
Right. Thank you.
okay. The variance in that category of over $500,000 is primarily the result of a sale of property on Milpas Street during the past fiscal year. And I do believe I mentioned that at the last briefing that we had. But we do expect that this variance will increase slightly as a result of year-end accruals. We're not quite finished with closing the books, so there might be some other miscellaneous revenues that have resulted in additional revenue. And those financials will be presented to the Finance Committee in the later part of September. Okay. And in the category of fines and service charges, these are basically comprised of the various department charges for services, and overall these revenues are slightly above the revenue estimates. Parks and Recreation are above budget by approximately $340,000. This is primarily as a result of increased demand and interest in the active adult classes at the Carrillo Recreation Center, and an increase in youth and cultural arts programs throughout the city. In addition, we have an interfund charge line item with a slight variance, which is primarily the result of some city attorney fees that were reimbursed from the RDA successor agency. These are interfund charges. And the final slide really is your overall general fund revenues budget to actual comparison. And as you can see here, we have exceeded our estimates. As I mentioned earlier, we will be finalizing year-end closeout, which will result in some additional minor revenue accruals. And so the preliminary number will slightly change at year end. Before variances, or the subtotals actually were over 2.9 with the anticipated year-end variances of 1.2 million. So we're looking at about a 1.78 figure or more, again, as I mentioned, with the year-end accruals. And with that, I'm available to answer any questions.
Okay. Questions from committee members? No?
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Ms.
Julie?
Wilson.
Okay. Good afternoon, Chair Francisco, committee members. I'm Julie Nemes. I'm the accounting manager for the finance department. And today I'm going to be going over general fund expenditures, enterprise funds, and proposed budget adjustments. So I'm going to start with general fund expenditures. Normally when we come back at mid-year and third quarter, we talk about year-to-date variance without encumbrances because there's still a remainder of the year to spend those encumbrances. Today, I'm actually going to talk about the variance both without encumbrances and with encumbrances because those are still monies that might get rolled over to next year that they want to continue to spend. So I'm going to be focusing first on the year-to-date budget, which, because we're at the end of the year, does equal the annual adjusted budget. The year-to-date actual, which is what's spent through those 12 months. And as Jeannie mentioned, there are still some year-end adjustments that will be posted. So these aren't, these are preliminary results. There's still going to be final results that will come back in September to give you a report, and then we do our year-end CAFR. And the first number that I wanted, the column that I referred to was the year-to-date variance without encumbrances. So this doesn't take into effect any of those open purchase orders at year-end. This column does take into account any open purchase orders and encumbrances at year-end. So this would mostly come into play when maybe you have a department that might be over budget on expenditures. We'd also want to look at, do they have any encumbrances outstanding that would even potentially put them further over budget, or do they want to roll over to next year? So I'm going to be going over some significant variances and negative variances, so any of the departments that have actually exceeded budget as of June 30. The first one is city attorney. During the year, if you'll recall, we talked about this a few times, and City Council did approve the one-time vacation cash outs. The majority of this variance, both the 17 and the 25, is related to a one-time vacation cash out. It was unbudgeted of about $28,000. And most departments were able to absorb that, but city attorney wasn't. So that's where this variance comes from, and we are proposing an adjustment that I'll talk about later. Next one is fire. Jeannie briefly mentioned mutual aid activities for the year. They were actually higher than what was originally budgeted. So when there's mutual aid activities, there's costs associated with that, but then there's also a corresponding revenue associated with that. So this additional expenditure, both at the 311 and the 349, there's additional mutual aid revenues. So we'll be proposing adjustment both to estimated revenues and to appropriations that I'll talk about during the proposed budget adjustments. I wanted to talk about Parks and Recreation because even though they seem that they're at budget at year end, they do have some outstanding encumbrances that would take them over budget by about $87,000. During the year, primarily recreation programs, there were some new programs and they enhanced existing programs. Because of that, they had increased costs. They're related a lot to hourly salaries, some contracted services. So even though they had these additional costs, they also had a significant increase in revenues because of these enhanced programs. And their total was about, I believe it was about $355,000 in additional revenues that was largely due to these enhanced recreation programs. So we'll be proposing an adjustment for that as well. And I also wanted to touch on community development just because it was a rather large variance. It is a positive variance that came in under budget, but I just wanted to touch on it because it was a pretty significant amount. A significant portion of this, about $400,000, is related to salaries, savings in salaries and benefits. There were several vacancies, hourly and some full-time positions. That was a large part of it. The rest of it was really across the board savings, with supplies and services. So at third quarter, community development they were not sure if their revenues were going to meet budget for revenues. So they did decide to make some cost-cutting measures as of third quarter to try to reduce expenditures in anticipation of potentially not meeting their revenues. And so that's why we see such a significant under expenditure here. So overall for the...
Question.
Sure.
Thank you. As I recall, there was the general fund loaned community development money for Plant Santa Barbara. And is any of that money being paid back at this point? And what's the schedule on that?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. Committee Member White, the general fund did lend money to the GPU, the General Plan Update. It's somewhere between $2 and $3 million. Every year, they are generating revenues between $80,000 to $100,000. So every year they are repaying the general fund by that amount. But as you can see, by $80,000, $100,000 a year, it's going to take a number of years before they fully repay that. But that is factored
That's
into
kind of the rate of return,
Yes.
or not rate of return, that's
Right.
bad words to use there, but the rate of money coming back.
a repayment, yes.
Okay.
And those revenues are factored into their overall revenues
Great.
for community development.
Thank you.
Sure. Ms. Maria.
While you're there, maybe Mr. Casey is the person to ask. So did the department purposely not hire? I think you said that the savings was because of unfilled positions. Are you having trouble hiring people?
Mr. Chair, no, we're not having trouble hiring people at all. It was a number of factors. We had an overfill position with the dissolution of the redevelopment agency that we budgeted for the entire year, but we were able, through attrition, to get out of that overfill hire very quickly into the fiscal year. So that was one big chunk of savings. We had some people who went on maternity leave and some other things that created some cost savings. And then, as Ms. Nemes said, our revenues were really erratic, and we weren't sure we were going to come in at the end of the fiscal year. And so for the last quarter or so, we were just cautious on all of our other expenditures to kind of maintain those savings, and revenues ended up coming on right at budget. So we, did well on revenues based upon our shrewd budgeting outlook 18 months prior.
Thank you.
So overall, the general fund came in under budget by about $1.8 million without encumbrances, and with encumbrances by about $1.5 million. Any questions on general fund before I move on? Great.
Mr. White.
So then that money would then go to half to reserves and half to capital then? Is that where that?
I believe that's how, yeah,
Okay,
correct.
thank you.
All right, I'm going to move on to enterprise funds. Overall, the enterprise funds, all but one, came in under budget for expenditures and over budget on revenues. But I'm going to go over some of the significant variances and touch on golf fund that came in under revenues and over on expenditures on expenses. Once again, I'm looking at the year-to-date budget, which matches the annual budget, the year-to-date actual, and then the year-to-date variance. The first one I wanted to look at was the water fund. This year was a very dry year, and so really the majority of this is due to increased water sales. On the expense side, this number is actually a little bit higher. It shouldn't be quite this high because we still have some year-end adjustments to make. We have some debt adjustments to make that are about $600,000, so that's going to pull this number down by about between $600,000 and $700,000. The remainder of that on the water fund is there's several savings in different areas. One of the savings main areas of water purchases, which is a fixed cost for the water fund. So there was about $700,000 in savings there. They had savings in salaries, utility costs, chemical supplies. So there really was several different areas where they had some reduced costs, and that generated about 3.6 million in savings at this time. Next, I'm going to talk about the wastewater fund. In terms of revenues, they came in right about at budget, but expenses did come in under budget by 1.7 million. There was several different areas where they came in under, but reduced facility maintenance needs, utility costs, and some special projects being postponed to fiscal year 14. That was a good majority of why that difference existed. Downtown parking fund, I think we touched on this at mid-year and third quarter, but the downtown parking fund saw significant increase in revenues this year for multiple reasons. They had no lot closures. They had increased their monthly parking went up for both the Granada Garage and the Coda lot. They're now accepting credit cards. So there's a lot of impacts that have now resulted in downtown parking, their revenues being higher than what they originally budgeted. For their expenses, this is largely due to some vacancies and also reduced maintenance expenses. But as a percentage of their budget, it's not a significant difference.
Chair?
Yes.
Mr. White.
I'd appreciate it, and this may not be the forum for it today, to hear about the Granada Garage. There was a forecast for how it was going to do as it ramps up through time, and just see how we're doing compared to that forecast would be, I think, a useful piece of information to have someday.
Okay, great. And this is the one fund I want to spend a little time talking about, the golf fund, is that their revenues did come in under budget and their expenses also were over budget. We have been closely monitoring the golf fund. You know, over the past few years, the golf course fund has definitely struggled just with the economic change. And their green fees took the biggest hit this year. It was about $44,000 came in under budget, but their concession revenues were actually above budget by about $20,000, and they had some other line items in interest income, a few $1,000s. Overall, about $18,000 under budget. Their expenses came in about $28,000 over budget, and they don't have any outstanding encumbrances. So this is a good number, this $28,000. And this is largely due to a one-time vacation cash out of $13,000. They had additional vacation cash outs of just retiring employees or leaving employees of about $8,000. And then they also had very high water costs just from the dry year. You know, they were impacted by a dry year and having to purchase more water, and that increases their costs. So because of this, we are proposing an adjustment, and I'll get into that a little bit later. I think, I can go back. Did anyone have any questions on the enterprise funds?
No, thank you.
All right, great. I'm going to move on to the proposed budget adjustments. The first one, and a lot of these I've touched on during the analysis of the general fund and the enterprise funds, but there are a few in here that are additional requests either from the department or that we've identified internally in the finance department. First one is city attorney. Even though we ran these reports for the 12 months, I do look at the information up through the end of last week to just see where they are and see, how far they are potentially over budget so that we can get an accurate picture of what we would need to request of you in terms of a proposed budget adjustment. And as of about a week ago, they were about $28,000 over budget. So we are requesting a adjustment to both estimated revenues and vacation and appropriations for that one-time vacation cash out from their additional successor agency reimbursements. This is one I haven't, there's actually two entries here, and I haven't touched on these earlier. These are requested from the department. The first one is related to AB 109 Public Safety Realignment Grant. I'll give you a little background on this, is that the police bills Santa Barbara County quarterly for overtime salary costs related to this grant. And for 13, the activity for this program was not budgeted. So what we're doing here is we're requesting an increase, or actually requesting the only entry to estimated revenues and appropriations for the activity for this grant. The second entry is transfer SaberNet revenues budgets to the Miscellaneous Grants Fund. This is another grant-related issue with the police. They received granting for one full-time officer to participate in the Regional Narcotics Enforcement Team. We refer to it as SaberNet. And in fiscal year 13, the revenues were budgeted in the general fund, but they were recorded in the Miscellaneous Grants Fund. The expenses were budgeted in the Miscellaneous Grants Fund. The expenses were paid out of both funds. So what we're doing here is requesting to have the revenue budget transferred to miscellaneous grants so that all of the budget, both for the revenues and for the appropriations, is in one fund, and then we'll transfer the remainder of the expenditures that are in the general fund back to miscellaneous grants so we can show all the activity in one fund.
One question about that.
Sure.
The overtime related to AB 109, do you know how that's calculated?
I don't, but I can find out.
Okay.
The next entry I touched on earlier was related to the fire department's mutual aid activities. There was about we're requesting an additional $400,000 to appropriations and estimated revenues for the mutual aid activities. There's about $155,000 in revenues at year end that they've billed but haven't received yet. So we'll actually be booking an accrual for that. For Parks and Recreation, this is when I was mentioning that I run financials about a week ago to see where they stand, Parks and Recreation Department did ask me to close about $20,000 worth of open purchase orders that they no longer need. They decided they don't need to spend that money. So this is why it reduces the number. Originally, you saw in my analysis is about $87,000. That's why we're requesting an entry for only $67,000. So it's actually a request to increase appropriations and increase estimated revenues from their additional revenues they had this year for $67,000 as opposed to $87,000. Community development. If you recall, at third quarter, what we did an entry to move the overnight accommodation funds from affordable housing. And what we did was we removed the remaining budget, and we transferred the remaining expenditures and revenue budget. But when we went back and looked at it, we said it'd be a lot more helpful to have all of the activity for the year in one fund rather than just from one point in time. So this entry is that's what we're requesting here, is to move the original budget, the part that we hadn't moved at third quarter, so that we have all the activity for 1 year. Any questions before I move on?
No.
Great. Miscellaneous grants. This is the first part of this entry is the other side of the SaberNet entry, the one to transfer the revenue budget to the general fund. The second one is a new request. It's for what they call the Avoid the 12 grant. And what this is that the police department receives funding from two California grants for a multi-agency campaign against impaired drivers. And we call it the Avoid the 12 grant. I'm not sure why, but that's what it's titled as. They do billings are submitted quarterly for overtime costs for DUI checkpoints and DUI activities. And these entries will increase both appropriations and estimated revenues for this activity. As of right now, there was no budget for revenues and expenses for this grant. City Affordable Housing Fund, this is the other side of the entry that I showed on the prior page, to transfer the overnight accommodation funds from the Affordable Housing Fund to the general fund. I'm going to talk about this entry and the one right after it together because they relate to each other. The Airport Capital Fund and the Airport Bond Capital Fund. Prior to fiscal year 13, the Airport Capital Fund actually paid for expenditures related to the Airline Terminal Improvement Program. And so during this fiscal year, they've requested reimbursement from the Airport Bond Capital Fund for those expenses. So that's what this is doing, is transferring from the Airport Bond Capital Fund to the Airport Capital Fund for reimbursement of those expenses. And our last entry is the Golf Course Fund. As of last week, the Golf Course Fund was $28,000 over budget in terms of expenditures. So we are requesting an entry out of reserves for Golf Fund to increase appropriations because there aren't available revenues to pull the increase in appropriations from. We did look at the reserve balance as of the beginning of fiscal year 13. The Golf Fund had a reserve balance of $435,000, which was about $156,000 below policy reserves. So this will impact that number. I think that's it. Any questions?
Mr.
White?
Chair.
Ms. Murillo.
Thank you. So this overnight accommodations, that's the money that came from the youth hostel? Is that
It was
right?
from the California Hotel, I believe. Oh.
Yeah, it came from the mitigation measure that was placed on by the California Coastal Commission for the loss of overnight affordable accommodations with
right.
the California Hotel as part of the Entrada project. And we're using
That's
the
right.
interest income to kind of help fund some of these homeless programs.
Okay. And then I know what avoid the 12 means. It's the 12 law enforcement agencies in the zone. So,
Oh, thank you.
yeah,
Good to know.
try to avoid getting pulled over. Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
Any questions, Mr. White?
Well, just the golf fund and the this taking of money out of the reserves. So how does that work? In order to put the reserves at policy level, those have to come out of the general fund. No. Okay. So how does that get patched up, except by cutting expenses and raising rounds of golf?
So the Gulf Fund, we've known that they've been at or below their policy reserves. You know, they've been just making their revenues in the last few years, in some cases not. But so they do have, $400,000, give or take, minus whatever we think we're going to consume this year, is a fair amount of money. It's still below policy reserves, but they're going to have to address this thing more structurally to find a way to become more solvent, more sustainable. And at some point, we are going to have to restore those reserves, but that's part of a larger plan that's being developed now and in the next couple of years in order to resolve this economic, but also just a change in play, reduction nationally in the number of rounds that are played that's affecting our local golf course. So they still have money, they have reserves. It's not where we think they should be, but it's still, a fair amount of money.
Alive, yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay. If there were no further questions, I would entertain a motion to accept the interim financial statements and to recommend to the full council that we approve the proposed adjustments to the fiscal 2013 budget.
Move the staff recommendation A, B, and C.
Second?
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Motion carries. Meeting adjourned. Thank you, ladies.